Hi everyone, welcome back. So by now we have understood, why the privacy is protected, right? So now here the next logical question is, what exactly is the law trying to protect? Right. So your data protection law, it does not treat all the data equally. Right. So the law actually creates categories of data because different types of data they create different level of harm, and different levels of harm they definitely require different levels of legal protection. So this topic is about understanding those categories, especially the personal data and the sensitive data, because every compliance obligation it later depends upon this classification. So here if you misclassify the data, your entire compliance framework it collapses. Okay, so let's start with the very basic, that what is data in legal terms, right? So I hope we are aware at this point that in law, data is not just any information, correct? So data, when you talk about the same in a legal aspect, it means an information related to an identifiable individual, right? So it should be related to an individual that is identifiable. This is the category that it should match, right? So here now this person may be direct or indirect, like the identification, or it could also be in e form, like in electronic form or digital form. So in a sense what I'm trying to say is, the focus is not on the format, the focus is on the identifiability, right? So let's say if the information can be reasonably linked to a person, then the law starts caring. Okay, so now let's start with the examples of personal data, or understand what personal data is. Now, when you talk about personal data, it means any data about an individual, again, as I've mentioned, who is identifiable either directly or indirectly. So, examples here could include your basic identity, like your name, email ID, phone number, or let's say your IP addresses that are linked to a specific user, the customer ID, I'll add that here, right? The location data that is tied to a device, right? So all of these are examples of personal data. Now here I hope you understand the key idea is, if the data it allows someone to be singled out, it becomes the personal data. Okay, now let's talk about the difference between direct and indirect identification, as I mentioned, right? Now, identification, it does not require a name. Okay, I'll just mention here. Okay, so a person, it can be identified directly, like via your government ID, like name, your Aadhaar card, or your PAN, or it could also be, the person could be identified indirectly through the combination of, let's say, the location, device ID, or behavior, right? I'll give you an example. For example, a data set without names is there, but it gives the precise location, the browsing patterns, and the purchase history. It can still identify a person, right? So this is why understanding, like when you give an anonymity and all of them, they are legally important later. Okay, now let's talk about why personal data it needs protection, right? Now, personal data it enables profiling, where uh, you can track, like get an invasive tracking of someone's habit, right? It can give you a behavioral prediction and targeted influence, right? Now, the harm is not just a data theft, the harm is the loss of autonomy, right? So this is why even the basic personal data cannot be collected or used freely without the legal justification. Okay, now let's start with what is the sensitive data. Now, when you talk about sensitive data, it's actually a subcategory of the personal data, right? So, like when you talk about sensitive data, it refers to the data Let's say if it is misused, it can actually cause serious harm, it can cause discrimination and irreversible consequences. So here the law therefore treats this data as high risk, right? So it's a risky profile. So not all personal data is sensitive, but when you talk about the sensitive data, that is personal and it can be very risky for that matter. Okay, now let's talk about the common categories of sensitive data. Now, sensitive data, it typically includes your financial information, like banking information, the transactions relating to it. It could also include your health and medical data, the biometric data, not to forget it, even the, sexual orientation, religious or political beliefs, your passwords, and authentication data. Now, these categories exist because misuse here can actually destroy the reputation, right? It can also deny the opportunities, and most importantly it can endanger the safety. So if this is misused, your sensitive data is misused, it can cause all these repercussions. All right. So now let's move ahead and understand that why now the sensitive data it attracts higher protection. So clearly sensitive data cannot be easily changed, like you cannot change a password, not a fingerprint, right? And it creates long-term consequences and we all know that it is deeply personal. Now because of this, the law imposes stricter consent standards, like stronger security obligations and tighter purpose limitations. So this is why data handlers, they must exactly know what category they are dealing with. Okay, now let's talk about the financial and the health. Okay, so let's talk about the biometrics first. So when you talk about the you know just let's make it very concrete here. So first let's talk about the financial data, right? So that's like your bank account details or card numbers or the transaction history. Or let's say when you talk about the health data, that would include your medical records, prescription, diagnostic records. Now if this is leaked, the financial data, it leads to fraud, right? And health data, it could lead to stigma and discrimination. That is why these are never treated casually in law, right? And now talking about the biometric data and the irreversibility here. So biometric data, it does deserve a special attention because the biometrics, they include your fingerprints for that matter, right? Or it could also include your facial recognition data, right? Iris scan, the voice patterns, everything, right? Now if this data is compromised, then the harm is very permanent in nature, right? Because you cannot reset a password. Like you can reset a password but you cannot reset your fingerprint. So this irreversibility is why the biometric data is always treated as sensitive. Okay, so here again, the context matters in data classification, because naturally the data, it does not exist in a vacuum, right? So the same data can be personal in one context, it can be sensitive in another, right? For example, let's say the location data casually shared among friends may be harmless, but the location data that tracked continuously by an employer, it becomes intrusive. So law looks at the context, purpose, and impact, and not just the labels. Okay, now let's talk about the difference between public data and the personal data. So here another misconception is that if let's say the information, let's say it is public, then the privacy doesn't apply. Now this is absolutely wrong, because publicly available data can still be personal, can still be protected, and cannot be freely exploited. So the law focuses on the use and not mere availability. Okay, now let's talk about data minimization and classification for that matter. So once the data is classified, the law expects minimum or minimal collection, right? Limited retention of the data, and even the like proportionate use, right? So here you cannot just collect sensitive data just in case, right? So the classification, it always determines that what you can collect, right? How long you can keep it, and how strong are your safeguards. So it's all upon this consent, security, and the retention here. Even like when you talk about the lawyers and businesses, like why they get this wrong is, like in practice the failures they happen because the data mapping is quite poor and the categories are misunderstood, right? So everything is actually treated just as data. So regulators and court, they actually do not accept the same as excuse. So again, most important thing, the ignorance of data classification is not a defense. So with this we come to an end of today's session. So to summarize, we can safely say that personal data, it identifies the individual, and when you talk about the sensitive one, it creates the heightened risk, right? So classification is the thing that would drive the compliance, and your context and impact, it definitely matters. So with this we come to end for today's session. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much, everyone.